Welcome to another EDH gameplay brought to you by the Salt Road Quartermasters, your source for salty EDH content. We have another game of competitive EDH for you today. Fernando is starting off piloting Brago, King Eternal. This Azorius deck is a control deck that uses lots of fast mana and stacks pieces to slow down his opponents. He relies on Brago to reset his fast mana and gain advantage. Next after that is Steve bringing Rielle, the Everwise. This Izzet deck is a discard matters deck that uses Rielle's ability to net positive on cards such as Faithless Looting. It's hoping to dig through the deck and assemble his Underworld Breach Wheel of Fortune combo. After Steve is Jimmy, who is piloting Tymna Thrasios. This used to be Flash Hook, but after the recent bannings has been transitioned into a Demonic Consultation Thassa's Oracle combo deck. And lastly, back to the channel is Rick, who brought his Tymna Kraum deck. Competing with Rielle, we have another wheel deck, which is also known as Opus Thief. It uses Notion Thief type effects, such as the Thief itself, Narset, or Waste Not, and a variety of wheels to gain advantage. Fernando starts off the game with a Sea of Clouds. Everyone declines to concede in response, and he taps it for a Mana Vault, and then ships the turn to Steve. Steve starts by cracking his Prismatic Vista, dropping to 39 for an island, and plays a Chrome Mox, imprinting an Ox of Gonius, and taps out to play an Izzet Signet. Jimmy has a Command Tower for land, and casts a Deathrite Shaman, passing to Rick. Rick cracks a Misty Rainforest, dropping to 39 to grab an Underground Sea, and passes back to Fernando. On Fernando's turn, he plays a Snow-Covered Plains for land, and taps everything for his commander, Brago, King Eternal. Steve starts his turn off with a Flooded Strand, and cracks it for a Volcanic Island, dropping to 38. He plays Jace, Wielder of Mystery. Steve upticks the Walker to mill himself for 2, milling a Jace's Archivist and an Ancient Tomb, and then draws a card. He passes after that. Jimmy shocks himself down to 38 to play a Hollowed Fountain untapped. He then exiles Steve's Prismatic Vista off Deathrite Shaman to cast the Birds of Paradise, passing to Rick after that. On Rick's turn, he plays a Glacial Fortress and passes. Fernando untaps and takes 1 off his tapped Mana Vault, dropping to 39, and plays another Snow-Covered Plains, and taps out for a Basalt Monolith, tapping that for an Arcane Signet. He proceeds to combat, hitting Steve for 2 with Brago, dropping him to 36, and blanks out his Mana Rocks and Brago. Steve starts off with a Mountain, and then upticks Jace, milling Fernando for 2, an Enlightened Tutor and a Snow-Covered Island, and draws a card. Steve then casts his commander Rielle, the Everwise, and then a Mana Vault. Jimmy plays a Plains as land and casts a Keenan, Bonder Prodigy. Steve, thinking this would net Jimmy too much advantage, casts a foil for its alternate cost, pitching an Island and a Grim Monolith, triggering Rielle to draw 2. With foil still on the stack, Jimmy fires back with a Dovin's Veto to counter the foil, and lets Keenan resolve. Rick has a quick turn, playing a tapped Godless Shrine and passes. Fernando starts off with a Fabricate, which Rick tries to counter with a Dispel, not realizing Fabricate is a sorcery, and instead has to use his Negate. Fernando, wanting his spell to resolve, counters back with a Flusterstorm, stopping Rick's shenanigans. Fernando finds and casts a Prophetic Prism, to which Jimmy counters with an Arcane Denial, womp womp. Jimmy exiles Steve's Flooded Strand to pay for it, thanks to Kinnan's doubling mana ability. Fernando then heads to combat, hitting Jimmy as payback for the counter magic with Brago. Making sure Fernando doesn't have a chance to get back on his feet, Steve cycles a Nimble Obstructionist to counter Brago's Blink ability. Unfortunately, we lost footage from Steve's camera for a little bit, but it does get fixed later on. On Steve's upkeep, Fernando draws 2, and Jimmy draws 1 from the Arcane Denial. Steve plays a Mountain and taps 6 for a Niv Mizzet Perun. He then upticks Jace, milling Fernando for 2 and drawing a card, pinging Kinnan with the Niv trigger. Steve follows it up with a Gitaxian Probe to look at Jimmy's hand, who reveals a Demonic Tutor, a Demonic Consultation, and an Exotic Orchard. How scary. He draws and finishes off Keenan with the Niv trigger. He finishes off his turn by casting a Mox Amber. Jimmy plays an Exotic Orchard as land for turn and goes for the Demonic Tutor for the other part of his combo piece, and Steve draws from Niv, pinging Jimmy's Birds, who taps it in response for mana before the Birds dies. Jimmy debates if Steve has anything to stop him, and hopes he doesn't. He casts Thassa's Oracle, and Steve asks the table if they have a response. Having none, Steve responds to the Oracle with a Pyroblast to counter the spell, pinging the Deathrite and drawing from Niv. Jimmy follows it up by casting his Demonic Consultation, naming Mystic Remora, in hopes to rebuild. The table all hopes that it's in the top 6 and that Jimmy would exile the rest of his deck. While it doesn't happen, it turns out Fish is at the bottom of his deck, so he removes most of his library, exiling the rest of his win cons. Rick starts his turn off by playing a Flooded Strand and cracking it for a Volcanic Island, dropping to 38, and continues his string of long turns by passing to Fernando. Fernando untaps and takes another point of damage from his tapped Mana Vault, dropping to 38. He casts a Talisman of Progress, letting Jimmy draw off from the Fish. Fernando moves to combat, hitting Steve for 2 Brago, dropping him to 34, and blinking out his Mana Rocks. After combat, Fernando tries to cast a Sun Titan, which Steve counters with a Force of Will, pitching a Jace Vryn's Prodigy and losing a life, dropping to 33. Steve forgets the Niv trigger, and Fernando passes. On Steve's turn, he forgets all of his Niv triggers, and he starts by ticking up Jace to mill Jimmy for 2 and draws. Steve moves to combat and swings at Fernando for 4 Rielle, dropping to Fernando 34 and passes after that. Jimmy starts his turn by playing a Tropical Island and forgetting to pay for his Fish, and realizes it's probably for the best seeing how many cards he has left in his library. He then casts a Priest of Titania, and after that his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. At Jimmy's end step, Rick casts a Drown in the Loch to try and remove Steve's Niv Mizzet. Steve draws and pings the Priest, and counters back with a Flusterstorm, drawing and pinging Brago. Jimmy responds, casting Swords to Plowshares, targeting Niv. Steve draws and pings Brago, and then casts Frantic Surge in response. Steve ends up drawing 5 cards between the Rielle, Niv, and the Search itself. This allows Steve to take out Brago with the rest of the damage, and puts the rest of the damage on Thrasios. He follows it up with a Pact of Negation on the Swords, pinging Thrasios and drawing from Niv. Not giving up, Rick stops the Pact with a Dispel from way back when. Steve finishes off the Thrasios with Niv, but could not find any more interaction, so the Swords resolves and Niv has finally been dealt with. Rick, not wanting to do anything on his own turn, just draws and passes to Fernando. Fernando plays a Strip Mine for land and goes for a Tezzeret the Seeker. He then casts a Spell Seeker to grab a Swords after he switches around the lands he used to tap for it, which he uses to exile Steve's Rielle, gaining Steve life and putting him to 38. Then Fernando downticks the Tez to search out a Lightning Greaves, which he equips to the Spell Seeker and attacks the Jace and passes after that. Steve plays an island for land and uses it to cast a Mystic Remora of his own, following it up with a Mana Crypt and a Chasm Skulker. Steve has an inkling that Rick was holding up a Notion Thief, so Steve leads with a Dockside Extortionist, to which Rick flashes in the Thief itself, before Steve gets the extra mana. Having no answer to the Thief, Steve lets it resolve, and gains 5 treasure. Steve casts a Laboratory Maniac, but literally has a hand full of wheels and is unable to cast anything. Jimmy plays the land that he's been showing off, Flooded Strand, and casts a Heuristic Study, passing to Rick. After 6 turns of complaining he hasn't been doing anything, Rick finally gets into the game by playing a Whispering Madness, causing everyone to discard their hand, and instead of drawing 4, Rick draws 16, while ciphering the card onto the Notion Thief. Rick then plays a Scalding Tarn, cracking it and dropping to 33 to grab a Badlands. Rick moves to combat and then swings at Jimmy. And on the ciphered cast of Whispering Madness, we ask for a count to see how many cards are left in Rick's library. Finding out he has 67 cards in his library and 16 cards in his hand, we know that if either Jimmy or I make him draw an additional card from the cast from either our fish or the Ristic, Rick will deck himself. Rick didn't realize until after he decided to cast the Whispering Madness that it would cause him to deck himself. So he scoops, and we all admit that he probably would have won the game if he hadn't gotten greedy. Fernando untaps and takes 1 off the tapped vault, dropping to 32. He uses Tezzeret's Plus to untap his mana rocks, and then taps them, taking 1 from his talisman, going to 31 to recast Brago. He goes to equip the Greaves. He follows it up with a Trinket Mage, who searches out in Arkham's Astrolabe, which Fernando casts and lets Steve and Jimmy draw, in addition to drawing the card himself from the ETB trigger. Fernando plays a snow-covered island for land and then heads to combat, swinging 2 at Steve, and in response, Steve mystical tutors, paying the study tax to find an Izzet charm, while Fernando blinks his board, searching out a Grafdigger's Cage from Trinket Mage and a Cyclonic Rift from the Spellseeker. He also resets Tezzeret and draws off the Astrolabe. Fernando then tries to overload a Cyclonic Rift, letting Steve and Jimmy draw, not realizing the Izzet charm that Steve had put on top of his library, which he uses to counter the spell, unless Fernando pays 2, which he does not. After realizing his mistake, Fernando downticks the Tezzeret to grab a Winter Orb, and casts the Grafdigger's Cage he had searched out earlier, letting Steve and Jimmy draw. Jimmy gets a little too excited to see a spell that he can interact with and decides to cast a Mental Misstep from the cage, while Fernando gripes that this would only hurt Steve and passes after that. Steve untaps his 1 land, a volcanic island, and plays a Cephalid Colosseum for land. He rolls for Crypt and takes 3. He starts by uptaking Jace to mill Jimmy and draw a card, gaining more counters on Chasm Skulker. After, he plays a Narset, Parter of the Veils, letting Jimmy draw, and then downticks the Walker to reveal an Underworld Breach. He goes to cast it, and Jimmy asks if he will pay for the Ristic tax. Steve points out he can't draw because of the Narset, and then Jimmy casts a Reclaim, putting Thassa's Oracle on top, still not getting he won't draw off the Ristic. Steve starts off with a Frantic Search to get access to more colored mana. He draws and untaps 3 lands. He follows it up with the Grim Monolith, and then casts a Wheel of Fortune, and Fernando starts to scoop up his cards because he knows Steve can cycle through his deck and win with Jace. Game recap. Overall, the game was fairly even. Fernando was unlucky that he didn't draw any of his card drawing mana rocks, so while he had a lot of mana, he wasn't able to capitalize on his early game advantage. Jimmy took a gamble twice, and unfortunately both did not pay off. Steve had the counter magic for his Thassa's Oracle, and the Consultation removed nearly his entire deck, neutering his chance of winning. Rick probably would have won the game if he had counted his deck before casting the second wheel. While Rick complained that he didn't cast many spells that game, his counter magic did come in helpful. Steve managed to pull off another victory this game. He luckily was able to keep the Niv Mizzet on the field for a good amount of time, gaining him a lot of advantage, and got lucky when Jimmy decided to counter the Grafdigger's Cage, which allowed him to combo out for victory. If you enjoyed the game, please consider subscribing to the channel or liking the video, as it really helps us keep creating these gameplays. As always, stay salty, and we will see you guys later.